The moment my father raised his wine glass at that dinner table, smiled at me with those cold gray eyes, and said, "We just wanted you to see what success looks like, since you'll never have it yourself," I felt something shift inside me. Not break. Shift. Like a tectonic plate quietly moving underground before the earthquake that nobody sees coming. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I didn't throw my napkin down and storm out. I just smiled, set down my fork, and said, "Thank you for dinner, Dad." And in that moment, I made a decision that would change all of our lives forever. But to understand why that dinner mattered so much, why those words hit me the way a sledgehammer hits ice, I have to take you back to where it all really started. Because this story didn't begin that night. It began the day I was born into the wrong family and spent the next 31 years trying to love people who saw me as nothing more than a supporting character in their story. My name is Rachel, and this is the story of how my family tried to destroy me and how I let them think they succeeded, right up until the moment I didn't. I grew up in a mid-sized city in Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where reputations travel faster than the truth, and where your last name is either a key or a cage. For me, it was both, and then it became neither. My father, Gerald Whitmore, was the kind of man that other men wanted to be and women wanted to impress. He was tall, silver-haired by 50, and had the kind of smile that belonged in a cologne advertisement. He owned a real estate development company that his own father had built from scratch, and somewhere along the way he decided that inheriting something made him the same as building it. It didn't. But nobody told him that, at least, not while it could have mattered. My mother, Patricia, was beautiful in the way that cold marble is beautiful. Impressive. Untouchable. Decorative. She hosted charity lunches and sat on the board of the local arts foundation, and she loved her children the way you love trophies. As long as you were winning, she displayed you proudly. The moment you started tarnishing, she put you in a closet. And then there was my brother Daniel. If my father was the kind of man other men envied, Daniel was the kind of man who made sure they knew they should. He was 2 years older than me, and from the very beginning, he was the golden child. Not because he was more talented or more intelligent, he wasn't, though he'd cut out your tongue if you said so, but because he was a boy, and in the Whitmore household, that one fact mattered more than anything else. Daniel could fail a class, and Dad would laugh it off. Rachel failed a class, and there were family meetings about my character. Daniel crashed his car at 19, and Dad bought him a new one. Rachel got a speeding ticket at 20, and Mother didn't speak to me for 2 weeks. Daniel dropped out of college after 1 semester to pursue business, and Dad handed him a position in the company. Rachel graduated summa cum laude from a state university, and Dad said, "Good, now maybe you can find a husband." I wish I could say I'm exaggerating. I'm not. But here's the thing about growing up like that. It does one of two things to you. It either breaks you so completely that you spend your whole life looking for people to fill the holes your family dug in you, or it makes you so quietly, fiercely determined that you become something your family never saw coming. I spent a lot of years being the first kind of person, and then, eventually, I became the second. I left Ohio at 23 with a beat-up Honda Civic, a marketing degree, $1,100 in savings, and a determination to prove to myself, not to them, never to them, that I could build something real. I moved to Chicago. I got a junior position at a mid-sized marketing firm. I shared a 2-bedroom apartment with 2 other women, ate a lot of ramen, and worked so hard that I still sometimes dream about those fluorescent office lights. The calls home were always the same. Dad would ask how Daniel's division of the company was doing, not ask me how I was doing, but use the call to talk about Daniel. Mother would ask if I'd met anyone. Daniel, when he bothered to pick up, would ask if I needed money in a tone that made clear he hoped I'd say yes. I never did. For 8 years, I built my life in Chicago. I climbed from junior associate to senior account manager. I brought in clients that tripled the revenue in my department. I bought my own apartment, small, but mine. I built a real savings account. I made real friends. I fell in love, got my heart broken, healed, and fell in love again with a quiet, kind man named Marcus who thought I was extraordinary, which was more than I could say for anyone I'd grown up with. And through all of it, I kept a careful, polite distance from my family. Birthday calls. Christmas visits every other year. I didn't cut them off completely. I told myself it was because I still loved them, and maybe that was true. But I think the deeper truth is that I was still hoping, the way you hope when you know better but can't help yourself, that someday they'd look at me and actually see me. Really see me. But that's not what happened. What happened was the dinner. And I didn't see it coming. But neither did they. It started with a phone call from my father, which was unusual enough on its own. Dad didn't call me. He called Daniel. He called his golf buddies. He occasionally called his secretary on weekends, though everyone politely pretended not to know that. He did not call Rachel. So when my phone rang on a Tuesday evening in March and his name appeared on the screen, I felt that old, complicated flutter in my chest. The one that still, after everything, whispered, "Maybe this time." "Rachel," he said, in that voice he used when he wanted something. "Your mother and I are flying into Chicago next Friday. We thought we'd take you to dinner. Catch up." I should have noticed the way he said it. Catch up. Not "I miss you." Not "we want to see you." Catch up like I was a file that needed to be updated. "Daniel's in town too," he added. "He has a meeting with some investors. We thought it would be nice, the four of us." "Sure," I said. "That sounds great." And I meant it. Genuinely. Because I am, despite 31 years of evidence to the contrary, an optimist. Or maybe I was just still that little girl who wanted her father to be proud of her. I should have known better. I really should have known better. The restaurant they chose was the kind of place that had no prices on the menu and a sommelier who materialized silently at your elbow. The kind of place where the lighting is so perfect that everyone looks a little more important than they are. I wore the best dress I owned, a deep burgundy wrap dress that Marcus had once told me made me look like I owned the room. I arrived first. I always arrived first to family events. Some old training about being the good one, the reliable one. The one who tried harder. My parents arrived together. My father in a suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. My mother in a cream dress she'd clearly bought specifically for the occasion. They looked beautiful together. They always did. That was the cruelest part. They were the kind of couple that made other people believe in love at first glance. Even though up close, their marriage was a performance that had been running so long the actors had forgotten there was ever a real version. Daniel arrived 12 minutes late, which I noted because Daniel always arrived late to everything. It was one of the ways he demonstrated that his time was worth more than everyone else's. He was wearing a suit too, open collar, no tie, that studied casualness that wealthy men perform when they want to seem approachable. He looked good. He always looked good. He'd gotten Dad's jawline and Mother's cheekbones, and he'd spent his whole life accepting that as a personal achievement. "Ratch," he said, giving me the briefest of hugs. "You look great." Very Chicago. I didn't know what that meant, but it didn't sound like a compliment. We ordered. My father chose a bottle of wine that I suspected cost more than my car payment. We made small talk, or rather, they made small talk, and I participated in the way a guest participates when they haven't quite figured out why they've been invited. Dad asked about my work. I told him about the campaign I'd just led that generated over $2 million in client revenue. He nodded in the way that meant he was waiting for me to finish. Then he asked Daniel about the company. And that's when I should have seen it. The way the energy shifted. The way my mother set down her wine glass with a little more deliberateness than necessary. The way Daniel straightened slightly, like an actor hitting his mark. "Actually," Daniel said, glancing at Dad, "there's some exciting news on that front." My father smiled. "Go ahead." Daniel turned to me then, and something in the way he looked at me made the small hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Not because he was angry or cold. Because he was pleased. And Daniel's pleasure, in my experience, had always come at someone else's expense. "Dad and I have been restructuring the company," Daniel said. "We brought in some new investors. Big ones. We're expanding into 3 new markets: Nashville, Denver, Phoenix. It's a 9-figure deal, Rachel. The company's going to triple in the next 5 years." "That's wonderful," I said. "The thing is," Dad said, picking up the thread smoothly, the way they'd clearly rehearsed this, "with the expansion, we've had to rethink the ownership structure. The investors required it, actually. Clean lines of inheritance. That kind of thing." I looked at him. I waited. "We've updated the trust. my mother said quietly. She was looking at her wine glass when she said it. The updated trust, my father continued, reflects Daniel's role in the company. Since he's been actively building it for the last decade, it made sense that the business assets would transfer to him entirely upon our passing. Of course, you'll still receive a portion of the liquid assets. How much? I asked. My voice was perfectly steady. I surprised even myself. Dad named a number. It was not nothing. But it was a small fraction, of what I had understood, in vague family conversations over the years, to be coming to both of us equally. The business itself, which was now apparently worth 9 figures, would go entirely to Daniel. I sat with that for a moment. I see, I said. It's just business, Rachel, Daniel said. He had the audacity to sound kind when he said it. You've never been involved in the company. It wouldn't make sense for you to. I wasn't asked to be involved in the company, I said quietly. I was encouraged to leave, actually, if you recall. There was a pause. And then my father did the thing I will never, for the rest of my life, forget. He picked up his wine glass. He looked at me across the table. He smiled, that advertisement smile, the one he'd given to strangers and investors and people he needed something for my entire childhood, and he said it. We just wanted you to see what success looks like, since you'll never have it yourself. The table was very quiet. My mother looked at her plate. Daniel looked at his wine. And my father just held my gaze, smiling, waiting to see what I would do. Here is what I didn't do. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't tell him that I'd built more from nothing than he'd ever built from everything. That my apartment in Chicago was more a home than any of the houses he'd ever owned. That the love I had in my life was realer than anything I'd ever witnessed in his marriage. I didn't say any of that. I set down my fork. I folded my napkin. I picked up my glass and took one slow, final sip of the wine he'd paid for. And I said, "Thank you for dinner, Dad." Then I stood up, smiled at the table, not his advertisement smile, something quieter and more final, and I walked out of that restaurant and into the cool Chicago night. I sat in my car for 17 minutes before I drove home. I know it was 17 minutes because I watched the clock. I sat there, and I breathed, and I let myself feel every single thing I was feeling. The humiliation, the grief, the familiar old ache of wanting something from people who had never been capable of giving it. And then I did something I had never done before in my entire life. I made a plan. Now, I want to be clear about something. When I say I made a plan, I don't mean I sat there plotting something illegal or vindictive or cruel. I'm not that person, and I never have been. What I mean is that I made a decision, quiet, deliberate, and absolute, to stop letting my family story about me be the story I lived in. And somewhere in that decision was the seed of something that, in the weeks and months that followed, would cost my father and brother everything they'd tried to keep from me. Not through anything I did to them, through what I discovered about what they had already done to themselves. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because there's a piece of this story I haven't told you yet. A piece that, on its own, seemed completely minor at the time, but which turned out to be the thread that, when I finally pulled it, unraveled absolutely everything. 3 months before that dinner, back in December, right around Christmas, I received an unusual email. It came from a woman named Sandra Howell, and it was addressed to me personally, not through the company, not through any mutual connection. Directly to me. In it, she introduced herself as a former accountant at Whitmore Development. She said she'd left the company 6 months prior, under what she described as circumstances I'd rather explain in person. She said she had information she believed I should be aware of as a partial heir to the Whitmore estate. She left a phone number. I almost deleted it. It smelled like a scam, or, at the very least, like disgruntled ex-employee drama that I wanted nothing to do with. I'd spent years building careful distance from that company and everyone connected to it. The last thing I wanted was to be pulled back into its orbit. But I didn't delete it. I put it in a folder labeled miscellaneous, and I forgot about it. Until the night of the dinner. I drove home from that restaurant, poured myself a glass of water, not wine. I wanted a clear head, and I opened my laptop. I found Sandra Howell's email, and I dialed her number. She picked up on the second ring. which told me she'd been waiting. We talked for 2 hours. What Sandra told me, calmly, methodically, with the precise, organized manner you'd expect from someone who had spent a career tracking numbers, was this. For the past 4 years, Daniel had been systematically siphoning money from Whitmore Development. Not embezzling in a crude, obvious way. Doing it through a network of shell companies, inflated contractor invoices, and creative commission structures that had been approved on paper by my father, who either didn't know, or knew and was complicit, or, and this was Sandra's quiet, careful suspicion, knew partially, benefited partially, and had structured things so that if anyone ever looked closely, Daniel would take the fall alone. Sandra had discovered it while conducting an internal audit in late 2022. She'd brought her findings directly to my father. He'd thanked her for her work, told her the company was handling it internally, and had her quietly let go 3 weeks later with a non-disclosure agreement and 6 months of severance. She'd signed the NDA, but she was not, she carefully explained, violating it by speaking to me. Because the NDA covered disclosure to third parties and competitors. I was not a third party. I was a named heir to the family estate. She'd done her research before she ever sent that email. She told me she'd been waiting for someone in the family to reach out. She'd been waiting for someone with reason to care. Do you have documentation? I asked. She did. Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Rachel, why didn't you go straight to the authorities that night? Why the patience? Why the strategy? Why not just pick up the phone and call the police? Because I am, whether I like it or not, my father's daughter. Not in his cruelty, not in his smallness, but in his understanding that power is not about the first move. Power is about the last move. And if I went to the authorities with Sandra's information that night, raw, emotional, unverified, I risked everything. Daniel and my father would immediately lawyer up. The documentation might not hold without proper corroboration. And I would become, in the family narrative, the vindictive daughter who tried to tear her family apart out of jealousy. I refused to be that story. So instead I made different phone calls. Quiet, strategic phone calls to people I'd spent 8 years in the business world learning to know. One of those people was a woman named Diane, a former client who had left corporate law to start her own white-collar defense firm, which meant she knew, in exquisite detail, exactly how financial crimes were committed because she'd spent years defending the people who committed them. I called Diane the next morning. She listened to everything I said. She asked a few very specific questions. She asked for the documentation. And then she said 3 words I will never forget. This is something. Over the next 10 days, while my family presumably congratulated themselves on a successful dinner, Diane and I worked. Sandra provided her documentation carefully, precisely within the limits of her NDA. Diane brought in a forensic accountant named Raymond who had previously worked for the SEC. Raymond spent 4 days going through the records. On the 5th day, he called Diane. He used the word egregious. I wish I could say I felt triumph when I heard that. I didn't. What I felt was something more complicated. Something that honestly looked a lot like grief. Because these were still my family. My father still had gray eyes that crinkled at the corners the same way mine did. Daniel still had a laugh I'd known since childhood. And somewhere underneath all the cold machinery of what they'd built and how they'd treated me, there were still the people I had once loved without reservation. But then I remembered the dinner. I remembered that smile. I remembered that exact sentence, delivered across a candlelit table like it was the most natural thing in the world. And I kept working. Here's what you need to understand about financial crimes like the ones Daniel had been running. They're not just crimes against the company. They're crimes against everyone connected to the company, the employees, the investors, the partners. The new investors Dad had mentioned so proudly at that dinner, the ones backing the 9-figure expansion into Nashville, Denver, and Phoenix, those investors were about to pour enormous amounts of money into a company with a 4-year history of internal fraud that had been actively concealed from them. That made it fraud against them, too. And those investors had lawyers. Very serious lawyers. I didn't have to do much. I just had to make sure the right information reached the right people in the right way at the right time. Diane knew exactly how to do that. On a Thursday evening, exactly 8 days after that dinner, Diane sent a carefully prepared package, the forensic accounting report, the relevant financial records, a memo outlining the full legal exposure, to the lead attorney for the investor group. She sent a separate package to the Ohio State Attorney General's office. And then we waited. I want to tell you the waiting was easy. It wasn't. There were nights I lay awake wondering if I'd made the right call. Not because I doubted what Daniel and my father had done, the evidence was unambiguous, but because I was still, somewhere inside, that girl who just wanted to be seen. And there was a part of me that kept whispering, is there a version of this where you don't have to burn it all down? But here's what I came to understand in those sleepless nights. I wasn't burning anything down. They had built something rotten and called it success. They had invited me to dinner to make sure I understood I would never measure up to it. The burning was always going to happen. I just made sure I wasn't standing in the building when it did. The first sign that things were moving came 11 days after Diane sent those packages. I got a text from Daniel. It said, "Call me." Not hello. Not his name. Not any context whatsoever. Just call me. I texted back. Busy this week. Everything okay? He didn't respond. 2 days later, my father called. His voice, when I picked up, had something different in it. Like the polish had worn off slightly at the edges. Like something underneath was starting to show through. "Rachel," he said, "have you been speaking to a woman named Sandra Howell?" "I speak to a lot of people, Dad," I said pleasantly. "Is there something specific you're calling about?" There was a pause. The kind of pause that sounds expensive. "There are some business matters," he said carefully. "Your brother's been dealing with some complications from a disgruntled former employee. We may need to." "Dad," I said, still pleasantly, "I have a meeting in 10 minutes. Can I call you later this week?" Another pause. "Yes," he said. "That would be fine." I never called him back. 3 weeks after the dinner, the investor group pulled out of the deal. Their lawyers had reviewed the documentation, requested an emergency audit of Whitmore Development's financials, and determined that the company was insufficiently transparent to proceed. The public statement their firm released was polite and careful, the kind of corporate language designed to say everything and nothing simultaneously. But in the real estate world, in the business community my father had spent his entire life building his reputation inside, everyone understood exactly what it meant. The 9-figure deal was dead. I heard about it from a former colleague who still lived in Ohio. She sent me the article from the local business journal with a simple message. "Did you see this?" I sent back, "Wow, that's unfortunate. But I want you to understand something. That wasn't the end. Not even close to the end. Because the Attorney General's office, once they received Diane's package, had their own forensic team. And unlike the private investigators hired by the investor group, the AG's team had subpoena power. Within 2 weeks of the investor pullout, they had issued subpoenas for Whitmore Development's financial records going back 7 years. They interviewed 3 former employees. They requested records from 2 of the shell companies Daniel had been routing money through. Daniel hired a criminal defense attorney. My father hired 3. I know all of this because small cities run on information, and information travels fast. And because Sandra, watching from a careful distance, occasionally sent me updates. Not in violation of her NDA. She'd simply heard things she thought I might want to know. The specific total that Raymond and the AG's forensic team ultimately confirmed, the amount Daniel had taken from the company over 4 years through his network of shell entities, was north of $3 million. $3 million. From his own family's company. From the company his grandfather had built with his bare hands. My father was not charged initially, but his role in Sandra's dismissal, his approval of the fraudulent contractor invoices, the question of whether his willful ignorance constituted complicity, all of that was under active investigation. His lawyers were very busy. Extraordinarily expensive. The money for those lawyers had to come from somewhere. The company, with the investor deal dead and now under legal scrutiny, stopped being the cash machine it had been. Projects were frozen. Lenders got nervous and started asking questions. Contracts were reviewed. Within 3 months of that dinner, Whitmore Development had laid off 14 employees and suspended 2 major developments that had been in progress for years. The expansion into Nashville, Denver, and Phoenix The thing my brother had announced at dinner with that proud gleam in his eyes, the thing that was going to triple the company, the thing that made them fly to Chicago to make sure I understood I would never be part of it, was dead before it ever took a single breath. My mother called me 6 weeks after the dinner. She'd never been a woman who showed vulnerability easily. She'd decided early in her life that emotion was weakness, and she'd excised it from her repertoire the way you remove a splinter, completely, and without ceremony. But when she called that night, her voice had something unfamiliar running through it. Something thin and frayed and very tired. "I don't understand what's happening," she said. I sat with that for a moment, because in some other version of this story, I would have felt satisfaction hearing those words. I didn't. What I felt was something quieter and sadder. Something that felt more like watching a building you grew up in finally show the cracks that were always there. "Tell me what you know," I said. She told me. She told me about the investigation, about Daniel's lawyers, about the investors walking, about my father's sleeplessness and his increasingly short temper. She told me about the conversations she'd half overheard, standing outside doorways the way women who've spent their lives on the periphery of powerful rooms learn to gather information. She didn't know about my role in any of it. I hadn't told her, Diane, and I had been careful about keeping my involvement quiet. "I'm sorry, Mom," I said. And I meant it. Not for what had happened. What had happened was the only thing that could happen given what Daniel had built. But I was sorry she was caught in the aftershock of it. Collateral damage in a war she'd never quite understood was being fought. "Your father," she started and then stopped. "I know," I said. "He wasn't always," she tried again. "I know," I said. And I did know. I knew that behind the performance of my father's life was a man who'd been handed something and decided that protecting it required becoming someone who didn't deserve it. I understood that. I didn't excuse it, but I understood it. We didn't talk about the dinner that night. Not directly. Not yet. But before she hung up, my mother said something I had spent 31 years never expecting to hear from her. She said, "I wish things had been different. With you. With how I treated you." She hung up before I could respond. I sat for a long time in my apartment after that call. The city hummed outside my window. Marcus was asleep in the next room. And I just sat there with the phone still in my hand, feeling the weight of a sentence I had needed to hear for 31 years arriving, finally, when I no longer needed it to survive. That's one of the harder things about this kind of story. The apologies, when they come, don't land the way you spent years imagining they would. They don't fix anything. They don't go back in time and sit beside you in the car while you cried on the drive home from Christmas. They don't unread the emails or unhear the comments or undo the dinner. They just arrive, quiet and imperfect, and you have to decide what to do with them. I decided to leave that one on the table for a while. Let it breathe. Here's what happened next. Daniel was formally charged. The charges included wire fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and misappropriation of company funds. The prosecution's case, from what I understood through Diane and through the coverage in the Ohio business press, was considered strong. The documentation was extensive. The money trail was clear. My father escaped direct criminal charges, at least initially, but his civil exposure was significant. And the reputational damage, in a city where his name had meant something for decades, was the kind that doesn't repair easily. He was no longer Gerald Whitmore, the successful developer who built on what his father started. He was Gerald Whitmore, whose son had stolen $3 million from the family company under his watch. That distinction mattered to him. I knew it mattered to him in a way that went deeper than the legal trouble, deeper than the money. It struck at the specific story he had been telling himself about his life. And there is nothing quite so quietly devastating as watching the story you've been living inside suddenly reveal itself as fiction. Whitmore Development survived, technically, but barely, and in a form my grandfather would not have recognized. Outside management was brought in. Assets were liquidated. The house I grew up in, the big one on the street with the oak trees, the one my father had renovated twice and talked about constantly as though it were a monument rather than a building, was sold. I heard about the sale from my mother. She mentioned it the way you mentioned something that happened a long time ago, even though it was recent, in a voice that had already made peace with it. "It's just a house," she said. I think it was the most honest thing she'd said in years. For months after the dinner, a boutique firm in Chicago approached me about becoming a partner. Not an employee, a partner. They'd been watching my work, the campaigns I'd run, the clients I'd brought in, the revenue I'd consistently generated. They offered me equity. Real equity. The kind that builds into something meaningful over time. I said yes. Marcus took me out to dinner to celebrate. Not the kind of restaurant with no prices on the menu. Not anywhere with sommeliers and perfect lighting and the performance of importance. We went to a small Italian place 2 blocks from our apartment that had red and white checkered tablecloths and the best pasta I've ever eaten. We sat at our usual table in the ordinary light of a regular Thursday night, and he held my hand across the table, and he told me he was proud of me. No wine glass raised for effect. No carefully rehearsed smile. Just a man who meant exactly what he said, in a place where no performance was required. I thought about that restaurant. The one with the perfect lighting and the weightless menus and my father's steady gray eyes looking at me across the table. And I thought, this is what success looks like. I thought, I've been looking at it for years. 6 weeks before Daniel's trial was scheduled to begin, I received a letter. An actual handwritten letter, in an envelope with an Ohio postmark. The handwriting was my father's. I recognized it immediately from the birthday cards he'd signed with only his name, nothing else, for most of my childhood. Gerald, not Dad. Just Gerald, like a business correspondence. I opened it. It was 3 pages long, which was 3 pages longer than anything my father had ever written to me. I'm not going to share all of it. Some of it is private in a way that feels important to protect, even now, even after everything. But I'll tell you the part that stayed with me. He wrote, I've spent a great deal of time these past months reconsidering the story I've been telling myself about this family. The story in which I was the architect of something good. I think you saw, better than any of us, that the architecture was flawed from the beginning. I'm sorry it took me losing almost everything to be able to say that to you. I'm sorry we invited you to that dinner. I'm sorry for what I said. It was the kind of thing a man says when he is afraid, and I know that doesn't excuse it. I don't ask you to forgive it. I just wanted you to know that I know. I read that letter 4 times. Then I folded it and put it in a drawer. Not because it didn't move me. It moved me more than I can explain in words. But because there are some things you can acknowledge without rushing toward. Some wounds that need air before they can close. Some relationships that, if they're ever going to be repaired at all, need a long, quiet pause before anyone reaches for the other person's hand. My mother left Ohio that same month. Not forever, as far as I know. But she went to stay with her sister in Florida, and in our phone calls she sounded different. Quieter. More present. She'd started seeing a therapist for the first time in her life, which I thought took more courage than she'd ever been given credit for. I was never honest with myself, she told me in one of those calls. About your father. About what we were doing to you children. What we were doing to you. I know, I said. You deserved better, she said. I know that too, I said. I've known it for a long time. There was a pause. Not an uncomfortable one. Just the particular silence of 2 people sitting together inside the truth of something they can't go back and change. Marcus and I got engaged 3 months after that. He proposed at our little Italian place. No elaborate production, no velvet box on a silver tray. He just took my hand at our usual table and asked me, and I said yes before he finished the sentence. We kept the engagement small and real, the way we kept everything. My mother came to the dinner we threw with friends. She flew in from Florida, looked more like herself than she had in years, and spent the whole evening watching Marcus the way I'd always wanted someone from my family to watch him. Like he was genuinely good. Like I'd made a real choice. Like I deserved a real choice. Before she left that night, she hugged me the way that mothers hug daughters when they're trying to communicate something that words will never quite hold. And I held on too for a long moment, not because everything was healed. It wasn't. It isn't. But because imperfect love, offered honestly, is still something worth accepting. And I'd spent enough years refusing things on behalf of a pride that was starting to cost me more than it protected. It was a start, a real one. Daniel's case worked through the legal system. The plea negotiations, the back and forth, the appeals. I followed it distantly, the way you follow the aftermath of a storm from inside a house you've already secured. The version of Daniel that sat across that dinner table from me, in the open-collar suit, with the practiced ease of someone who had never doubted his own importance for a single day, that version is gone. Not forever, maybe. People do rebuild. But the particular life he constructed, the specific story he was living inside, collapsed completely. And what rebuilding looks like from that point is a very different kind of story than the one he thought he was writing. I went back to Ohio once, about 8 months after the dinner. Not for them. For me. I drove through the neighborhood where I grew up, past the schools I'd attended, the park where I'd learned to ride a bike, the street with the oak trees where the house had stood before it was sold. I drove past the restaurant where the dinner happened. I parked across the street and sat for a few minutes looking at the front of it, the kind of place that still looked exactly the same from outside, as though nothing that happened inside it had any permanent weight at all. Maybe that's true. Maybe the places where things happen never carry them the way we expect them to. I drove back to the highway. I drove back to Chicago. I had pasta with Marcus, and we talked about the wedding and the partnership and a trip we were planning and the ordinary, irreplaceable texture of our life together. And the whole time I felt that thing I had spent so long searching for in people who didn't have it to give. I felt seen. By the right person. On my own terms. In my own life. Here is what I know now about revenge, if you even want to call it that. I've resisted that word, honestly, because revenge implies doing something to someone. What I did was closer to refusing to do nothing. I refused to let information that could harm innocent people, investors, employees, partners, stay buried because exposing it was inconvenient to people who had never lost a night of sleep over what was inconvenient to me. The consequences that followed were the consequences of what my father and brother had built. I didn't build those consequences. I just made sure the building didn't stay hidden. And if that coincided with my family losing everything they'd tried to exclude me from, well, they had shown me, at a candlelit dinner with a perfect sommelier and a bottle of wine I'll never be able to remember the name of, exactly what they thought consequences were for. They were for other people. They were for Rachel. They were not for men named Whitmore who had decided, somewhere along the way, that success meant never having to account for anything. But here is what I want to leave you with. Because this story is about more than what happened to my father and brother. It's about what happened to me. The night I sat in that parking lot for 17 minutes, the night of the dinner, I had a choice. I could sit inside the humiliation and the old grief and the burning familiar ache of wanting something from people who could never give it, and I could let it swallow me the way it might have swallowed me 10 years earlier. I could have let that dinner be the thing that broke me. Instead, I asked myself one question. What do I actually know? And here's what I knew. I knew I had built something real. I knew I had a man who loved me and a career that was growing and a life that was mine. Genuinely, entirely mine. In a way that nothing Gerald Whitmore had ever handed Daniel Whitmore would ever truly be Daniel's. I knew that power built on other people's diminishment is not power. It is fear wearing a good suit. I knew that the story my family had been telling about me since birth, too small, too female, too gone, too nothing, was not a story I had ever agreed to live inside. I had just been waiting for the right moment to say so. And I knew in that parking lot that somewhere in the mess of my family's history was information that the right people needed to have. I was just the person who made sure it reached them. That's all I was. The person who refused to be quiet in the one moment where staying quiet would have cost everyone more than it saved anyone. My father told me, in front of his wine and his wife and his golden son, that I would never know what success looked like. I look at my life now, the partnership, the work that is genuinely mine, the man who chose me, the apartment that is a home in every sense of the word, and I want to say something to that version of my father. That smiling, certain, terrible version who sat across a restaurant table and thought he knew exactly who he was talking to. You had no idea who you were talking to. None of them did. And that, in the end, was never really my problem. It was theirs. The quietest, most expensive mistake they ever made was deciding, somewhere along the way, that I was someone they didn't need to worry about. Because I was patient. Because I was building something while they were performing something. Because I understood, even when they didn't, that the thing you build in the dark, quietly, without applause, without anyone watching, is the only thing that's actually yours when the lights come on. They had the lights. They had the stage. They had the wine and the restaurant and the smile and the trust that was supposed to tell me my place in the family. I had something better. I had the truth. And I knew exactly what to do with it. When the performance finally collapsed, as performances always do, eventually, because performances are not structures, they are just stories, and stories have endings, I was still standing. Quiet. Patient. Standing. And I will tell you this, right now, with everything I have, that is what success looks like. That is what it has always looked like. From where I'm sitting, it always was.